I came home early and froze in the hallway when I heard my daughter-in-law shout, "Sign the house over now, or you'll regret it." Then she slapped my 103-year-old mother so hard, her wheelchair crashed onto the floor. Every instinct told me to rush in. Instead, I quietly pulled out my phone and recorded every second. When she finally saw me, the color drained from her face. She moved fast, staged a rescue for her own camera, turned my son against me, and tried to destroy the evidence. She thought she'd buried it. She had no idea that afternoon was only the first piece of a nightmare she had built for herself, and that it was already coming apart. Welcome and thank you for being here on Revenge Dad. Let's start with a quick question in the comments. Where in the world are you joining us from today? Your answer might just surprise me. Some details in this story have been fictionalized for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real people or places is coincidental. The truth worth keeping is in the message. I've spent 40 years making sure bridges didn't fall. Not in any poetic sense, I mean it, literally. 40 years with the Montana Department of Transportation, walking steel and concrete structures in temperatures that dropped to 20 below, running my gloved hand along expansion joints, pressing my thumb into weld seams, crouching over cracked deck slabs with a flashlight, while semis thundered past, 6 inches from my shoulder. My name is Nathan Brooks. I'm 65 years old. And the one thing 4 decades of structural engineering taught me, the thing I carried home in my bones every single night, is that nothing collapses without warning. Every failure has a history. Every catastrophe begins with a crack so small that most people decide it isn't worth the trouble of stopping to look. I retired 3 years ago. My pension was enough to live on, though, barely enough for anything beyond that. I didn't mind. I'd never been a man who needed much. A small apartment near the freight yard on the east side of Red Willow, a reliable truck coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, that was the sum of what I required. What I couldn't scrimp on was my mother. Eleanor Brooks turned 103 years old last April. I know how that sounds. People hear that number, and their eyebrows go up, and they say something like, "She must be something." And I always say, "You have no idea." Because Eleanor Brooks is not the kind of woman that number conjures. She doesn't sit in a rocking chair staring at the wall. She reads the newspaper cover to cover every morning, argues with the radio. When the commentators say something she disagrees with, and still calls me by my full name, Nathan Allen Brooks, when she thinks I'm making a mistake. Her hands shake now, and her legs have given out entirely, which is why she uses a wheelchair. But her mind is a steel trap that hasn't lost a single tooth. She lives in the family house on the north edge of Red Willow, the house my grandfather built in 1948, the house where my mother raised me, and where she has spent more than 70 years of her life. After my son, Eric, married Vanessa 4 years ago, I moved out to give them space. It made sense at the time. The house was big enough for a young couple and an elderly woman, and I was only a 12-minute drive away. Eric worked long hours at the county planning office in Vanessa, while Vanessa was home most of the day. She had, as she often reminded people, chosen to dedicate herself to Eleanor's care. I want to be honest about something I believed her. Vanessa Colton. Vanessa Brooks now was 34 years old and knew exactly how to present herself to the world. She had soft eyes and a warm laugh and a social media following of nearly 40,000 people who tuned in regularly to watch her care for my mother. The videos were beautifully lit. She'd sit beside Eleanor's wheelchair and gently work a comb through my mother's silver hair, humming softly. And then she'd look into the camera and say something like, "Caring for the woman who built this family is the greatest privilege of my life." The comments would pour in, hundreds of them. "You're an angel." This made me cry. "Your husband is so lucky to have you." I watched those videos sometimes sitting in my apartment after a long shift, and I felt a complicated thing, gratitude and guilt in equal measure. Gratitude that my mother had someone with her. Guilt that the someone wasn't me. My son Eric was 38, broad-shouldered, quieter than he used to be. He and I had never been the kind of father and son who talked easily. We loved each other in the way that men in our family always had, through proximity and reliability rather than words. He worked, he came home, he deferred to his wife on most things. When I visited on weekends and Vanessa set a beautiful table and Eric smiled at her across it, I told myself this was what a good life looked like. I took the truck driving job 8 months after I retired. Part-time hauling construction materials for a regional supply company, steel rods, concrete, mixed lumber, the building blocks of things meant to last. The work kept my hands busy and added enough to my pension that I could pay for the part-time caregiver who came on weekday mornings. and for my mother's prescriptions, which had become considerable. Eleanor had a heart condition that required careful management. The medication wasn't optional. It was a Tuesday evening in late July, when I first felt the thing that engineers feel before they can name what's wrong, that low-frequency unease, the sense that something in the structure is off before any instrument confirms it. I had stopped by the house to drop off groceries, and Dorothy Hawkins was just leaving. Dot had lived across the street for 30 years. She was 71, sharp as a tack, and had been Eleanor's closest friend since the days when they both still drove themselves to church. She stopped me on the porch steps, her hand on my arm, her voice pitched low enough that it wouldn't carry through the front window. "Nathan, I need to tell you something, and I don't want you to brush me off the way you did last time." "What last time?" I said. 3 weeks ago, I mentioned Eleanor had been outside in the cold. She squeezed my arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. "It's happened again. Tuesday I counted she was out there on the side porch alone for nearly an hour. I could see her from my kitchen window. She wasn't dressed for it, Nathan. She had that thin cardigan on, and the temperature was 52 degrees. I felt a tightening across my chest, but I kept my face neutral. "Did you say anything to Vanessa?" "I tried," Dot said, and something flickered in her eyes, something careful like a woman choosing how much to reveal. "Vanessa said Eleanor had asked to go outside, said she checks on her every 15 minutes. She paused. "I want to believe that. I need you to know I've seen it more than once." I thanked her. I told her I would look into it, and I almost convinced myself I would do it calmly, systematically, the way I approached everything else, gather information before drawing conclusions. Inside, Vanessa was warm and welcoming, setting a pot of tea on the kitchen table, asking about my week with the attentive brightness of a woman who had nothing to hide. Eleanor sat in her wheelchair by the window, and when she looked up at me, she smiled, but there was something else in that smile, a weight behind it, the kind of expression a person wears when they've been carrying something alone for too long. "You look tired, Mom," I said, pulling up a chair beside her. "I'm 103, Nathan," she said. "I always look tired. That doesn't mean anything's wrong," but she covered my hand with hers, and her grip was tighter than usual. "Come see me soon," she said quietly. "Not just to drop things off. Come sit with me." "I will," I said. I didn't know then that she was trying to tell me something. I didn't know she had been trying to tell me for months. I drove home in the long Montana dusk, the mountains turning purple in the rearview mirror, and I tried to pin down what was bothering me. Dot's words, the way Eleanor had held my hand, the feeling of a hairline fracture I couldn't yet see. I told myself it was nothing. That was the last comfortable thought I had for a very long time. 3 days after my conversation with Dot, I sat in my apartment at 10 o'clock at night, watching one of Vanessa's videos on my phone. It had been posted that afternoon, 42,000 views in 6 hours. In the video, she sat beside Eleanor's wheelchair in the living room, working a soft bristled brush through my mother's silver hair with long, gentle strokes. Eleanor's eyes were half closed. The late afternoon light caught the side of her face in a way that looked almost painted. Vanessa hummed something low and unhurried, and then she glanced into the camera with those warm brown eyes and said, "Some mornings, I just stop and think how lucky am I to be trusted with someone this precious." The comments were exactly what you'd expect. This made me ugly cry. "You are literally an angel. Eric doesn't deserve you, LOL." I put the phone face down on the kitchen table. My coffee had gone cold. Outside the freight yard was quiet, just the distant clank of a coupling car and the low moan of wind off the mountains. I sat there with that tightening feeling in my chest again, the same one Dot had given me 3 days earlier, and I tried to name what was wrong with what I had just watched. Nothing on the surface, nothing I could point to. That was what bothered me most. I had been a structural engineer long enough to know that the most dangerous condition isn't a crack you can see. It's the absence of any crack at all when your instruments are telling you something is wrong. A bridge that looks perfect and reads wrong on the sensors is more frightening than one that shows its damage openly. You can fix what you can see. What you can't see will bring the whole thing down without warning. Vanessa's videos had been reading wrong on my instruments for weeks. I just hadn't been willing to admit it. The following Saturday, I drove to the house for dinner. Eric answered the door in a good mood, clapping me on the shoulder, the way he did when he wanted to show affection, without having to say much about it. The kitchen smelled like roasted chicken and rosemary. Vanessa stood at the stove in an apron, her hair pulled back, and she turned and gave me a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "Nathan, I made your mother's recipe, the one with the lemon and the garlic. She talked me through it this morning. That's her Sunday chicken, I said. She doesn't share that recipe with anyone. Vanessa laughed bright and easy. Well, she shared it with me. Eleanor was at the dining table, already a cloth napkin folded across her lap. When I leaned down to kiss her cheek, she squeezed my arm and held on a half-second longer than necessary. I straightened up and looked at her face, really looked, and noticed something I hadn't registered before. The skin beneath her eyes had a hollowed-out quality. Not the ordinary tiredness of age. Something deeper, like a lamp burning on less oil than it needed. "You sleeping okay?" I asked quietly. "If fine," she said. Then lower, "Sit close tonight, Nathan." I sat close. During dinner, Eric talked about a county zoning project he was working on. Vanessa refilled everyone's water glass without being asked me about my delivery routes, laughed at exactly the right moments. She was, by every visible measure, the ideal daughter-in-law. And yet, I watched her the way I watched a newly poured deck joint, the kind that looks smooth and solid right after the pour, but where you know from long experience that the real test comes later. Vanessa knew where the cameras were. She always knew. The angle she chose when she set her phone on the counter to film herself plating dessert. The way she touched Eleanor's shoulder when she passed behind her wheelchair, warm, natural, but just a half-second longer than a person does it when nobody's looking. Performed warmth has a texture to it. After 40 years of working with people on job sites, you learn to feel the difference. After dinner, Dot appeared at the back door with a plate of brownies. Eric let her in, and while he and Vanessa were in the kitchen cutting them up, Dot pulled me into the hallway, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was a man here Thursday night," she said. "Dark sedan parked out front around 9. He was inside for almost an hour, Nathan. I don't know who he was, but he was carrying a folder." My jaw tightened. "Did you see his face?" "Not clearly. Middle-aged, suit jacket." She pressed her lips together, eyes sharp. "Eleanor didn't mention him to you?" "No," I said. "She didn't." Dot gripped my forearm, her fingers pressing hard enough that I felt it through my sleeve. "Nathan, I'm not trying to make trouble, but I've known your mother for 30 years, and the last few months something isn't right in that house. I can feel it." I covered her hand with mine. "I hear you, Dot." "Good," she said, and her voice cracked the smallest amount. "Because I don't think she can say it herself." I drove home that night with Dot's words filling the cab of the truck like smoke. A man with a folder, 9 o'clock, an hour inside. I ran through explanations, insurance agent, estate planner, old family friend, and discarded each one. Eleanor would have mentioned it. Eleanor mentioned everything, every appointment, and every visitor the way people do, when their world has grown small enough that each detail carries weight. Unless she couldn't. I reached for my phone at a red light, almost called her, then stopped. Vanessa would be nearby. Whatever I needed to say to my mother, I needed to say it when we were alone. I put the phone down and gripped the steering wheel with both hands, watching the headlights cut through the Montana dark. Something was wrong in that house. I had felt it for weeks and called it nothing. I had watched it on a phone screen and called it gratitude. I had sat across a dinner table from it and called it a good life. It was time to stop calling it nothing. The call came at 2:14 in the afternoon. Dispatch said the customer at the north site had pushed the delivery to Monday. I pulled the truck onto the shoulder of Route 12, let a cattle hauler rumble past, and sat there for a moment with the engine idling. I had Eleanor's heart medication in the passenger seat. I'd picked it up from the pharmacy that morning, intending to drop it off after the delivery. Now, I had 3 extra hours, and no reason not to go directly. I pulled back onto the highway and headed toward the family house. Vanessa's silver sedan was in the driveway. Eric's truck was not. He was in Billings for a planning conference not due back until Sunday. I parked at the curb instead of the driveway the way I always did when I didn't want to announce myself before I was ready. Old habit. I grabbed the medication bag and walked up the front path. The door was unlocked. It was always unlocked when someone was home. Eleanor had never believed in locked doors during daylight hours. If I can't trust my neighbors, Nathan, I've already lost something more valuable than whatever's inside. I had a spare key regardless, clipped to my truck keys for 12 years. I pushed the door open and stepped into the front hallway. That was when I heard it. "Sign it." "What are you holding onto this house for?" "It's going to be ours anyway." The voice hit me like a hand to the sternum. It was Vanessa's voice, but stripped of every warm quality I had ever associated with her. No softness, no patience, just cold-coiled fury aimed at someone who couldn't fight back. My hand went to my phone before my brain caught up with the decision. I pressed record. Then I moved to the doorway of the living room and stayed there in the shadow of the hall where I could see without being seen. What I saw made my legs go weak beneath me. My mother sat in her wheelchair beside the dining table. Her shoulders were pulled, and her chin dropped, her whole body folded into itself, the way a person folds when they are trying to take up less space in the world. In front of her was a stack of documents and a pen. Vanessa stood over her, one hand braced on the table, the other wrapped around Eleanor's wrist, not holding it, gripping it. The tendons in Vanessa's forearm stood out with the pressure. "I told you," Eleanor said, and her voice shook, but it did not break. "Nathan needs to read anything I sign." "Nathan?" Vanessa said the name like it tasted bad. "Does Nathan come here every single day? Does Nathan change your sheets? Does Nathan sit with you at 2 a.m. when you can't sleep?" She leaned closer, her face inches from my mother's. "I do all of that, and all I'm asking is for what's already going to be mine eventually." "Then wait," Eleanor said. Vanessa's grip on her wrist tightened. Eleanor winced a small, sharp intake of breath that went through me like a blade. "I am done waiting," Vanessa said. "Sign the house transfer and the trust management over to me, today, right now." My mother raised her eyes and looked directly at Vanessa and said with a steadiness that made my throat ache, "This house will never belong to you." What happened next lasted less than 2 seconds. Vanessa released Eleanor's wrist, straightened up, and swung her open hand across my mother's face. The sound of it filled the room. Eleanor's head snapped to the side. Her glasses flew off and skittered across the hardwood floor. The wheelchair rocked backward and caught on the edge of the area rug and tipped, and my mother, 103 years old, went down onto the floor with a sound I will hear for the rest of my life. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to move, to cross that room, to put myself between my mother and the woman standing over her. I stayed where I was. I kept the phone steady. Because 40 years of accident investigation had burned one lesson into me deeper than any other. Accusation without evidence is just noise. Evidence is everything. Vanessa did not kneel down. She did not reach for Eleanor. She stepped back, looked at my mother lying on the floor, and said in a voice gone suddenly flat and businesslike, "You can't live forever, Eleanor. Think about that." Then she picked up her own phone from the table, set it on its stand, smoothed her hair with both hands, rearranged her expression into something soft and panicked, and dropped to her knees beside my mother. "Grandma, oh my God, are you okay?" She fell everyone. She fell again. I walked into the room. Vanessa spun around. The color drained from her face so fast it was like watching a fuse blow. "If you're so worried about her," I said, keeping my voice level. Despite the fact that my hands were shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the phone. "Why is your handprint still on her face?" "What this is in bestiad." For one moment, just one, the mask came completely off. Her eyes went wide and dark and calculating, running from my face to the phone in my hand and back again. Then she was on her feet, moving toward me. "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough." I stepped around her and knelt beside my mother. Eleanor's cheek was already darkening, a red bloom spreading beneath the skin. Her lip was split at the corner. But when her eyes found mine, they were not frightened. They were exhausted and relieved in equal measure. And she grabbed my hand with both of hers and held on with a grip that surprised me. "Nathan," she breathed. "I've got you, Mom," I said. "I've got you." Behind me, I heard Vanessa make a sound, a sharp, calculating intake of breath. And then the front door opened and Eric walked in. Back from Billings a day and a half early. He took in the scene in pieces. His grandmother on the floor, his father kneeling beside her, his wife standing several feet away, with her hair disheveled and her eyes already filling with tears. Vanessa crossed the room to him in 4 steps and pressed her face against his chest. "Eric," she choked out, "your father came in and started screaming at me, and when I tried to stop him, Grandma got caught in the middle, and she fell, and I—" "That's not what happened," I said. Eric looked at me over his wife's shoulder. His jaw was tight, his eyes confused and pained. "Dad, what—" "Your wife hit my mother," I said. "I have it on video." Vanessa pulled back from Eric's chest just far enough to look at the phone in my hand. Something shifted in her expression, a rapid, cold recalculation. Then she lunged forward and slapped the phone out of my grip. It hit the hardwood and slid under the edge of the couch. "There's nothing on there," she said, her voice climbing. "He's lying, Eric. He has never liked me from the very beginning. He has been trying to tear this family apart." Eric bent and picked up the phone. The screen was cracked diagonally. He looked at it, then at me, then at Vanessa, then at his grandmother, still on the floor, and something in his face did the thing I had been afraid of. It closed. "Dad," he said quietly. Maybe you should go. The words hit me somewhere below the ribs. I looked at my son. This man I had raised, this man whose bicycle I had held steady on the first day he rode without training wheels. And I understood that he had just made a choice, not out of cruelty, out of fear, because looking at the truth would cost him something he wasn't ready to pay. I called the ambulance. I set Eleanor gently upright. I picked up her glasses from the floor and put them back on her face. Then I stood, tucked the cracked phone into my pocket, and looked at Eric one last time. Remember this moment, I said. You chose to believe a lie over what was lying right in front of you. I walked out the front door. The medication bag was still in my hand. 6 minutes later, I was sitting in the truck at the end of the block engine, off watching the ambulance turn onto the street. The video was still on the phone. The screen was cracked, but the file was intact. I checked 3 times. I followed the ambulance to Red Willow Regional, in my truck staying close enough to keep its lights in sight the whole way. The paramedics had been professional and efficient. They always are in small Montana towns where everybody knows everybody, and the calls are rarely anonymous. One of them, a young woman with a red braid tucked under her cap, had looked at Eleanor's face, and then looked at me with an expression that asked a question she wasn't yet authorized to ask out loud. I gave her the short version. She nodded once tightly, and that was enough. In the waiting room, I sat in a plastic chair and stared at the cracked screen of my phone. The video file was still there. I had watched the first 30 seconds of it twice, just to be sure the audio was clear, the image steady enough. 40 years of field work had given me steady hands even when the rest of me was coming apart. And I was coming apart. I won't pretend otherwise. My chest felt like something had been tightened inside it with a wrench. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw Eleanor's head snap to the side and heard that sound, that flat percussive crack that no son should ever have to hear. Dr. Raymond Osei came out to find me 40 minutes later. He was 57 years old, a compact, careful man with close-cropped gray at his temples and the unhurried manner of someone who had delivered difficult news enough times to know that rushing it helped no one. He had been Eleanor's physician for 11 years. He knew her medical history the way I knew bridge load tolerances precisely, completely, with full understanding of what the margins meant. He sat down in the chair beside me rather than standing over me, which I noted and appreciated. Her cheekbone has a hairline fracture, he said. Her left wrist has a moderate sprain, consistent with someone grabbing and twisting it forcefully. Those are the acute injuries. He paused, folding his hands. Nathan, the other findings concern me more. Tell me. She's significantly dehydrated. Not from today, this has been building for weeks. Her blood work shows nutritional deficiencies that don't develop overnight. He held my gaze steadily. Eleanor is not a woman who neglects herself, which means someone else has been neglecting her. The wrench in my chest turned another half rotation. How long? I asked. Based on the markers, at minimum 6 to 8 weeks of inadequate fluid and caloric intake. He leaned forward slightly. Nathan, I want you to understand what I'm about to tell you. Under Montana law, section 52.381, I am a mandatory reporter. That means, when I have reasonable cause to believe an elder patient has been subjected to abuse or neglect, I am legally required to report it to Adult Protective Services. This is not a choice I'm making. It's an obligation the law places on me. APS will open an urgent investigation likely within 24 hours. I understand, I said. I have video. Something moved behind his eyes, surprise then relief, then a professional recalibration. You'll want to preserve that carefully. Don't send it to anyone yet. Talk to an attorney first. He stood, then stopped. She asked for you, by the way. When I told her we needed to keep her overnight for observation, the first thing she said was she wanted to make sure you were still in the building. I was on my feet before he finished the sentence. Eleanor was in a room at the end of the corridor, propped up against 2 pillows with a thin hospital blanket across her lap. The bruise on her cheek had deepened to a color that made my stomach turn. There was a small white bandage at the corner of her mouth where the skin had split. An IV line ran into the back of her hand, but her eyes, when they found mine, were clear and sharp and entirely Eleanor. You look worse than I do, she said. That's not possible, I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended. I pulled the chair close and sat and took her unbandaged hand in both of mine, and I held on. Nathan, her fingers tightened around mine. There's something I've been trying to find the right moment to tell you. For months I've been trying. She stopped, and I could see the effort it was costing her, the way her jaw set and her brow pulled together. I kept thinking I would find the right time, and then the right time kept not coming, and I Her eyes filled, which was something I had not seen in longer than I could remember. Eleanor Brooks did not cry easily. The fact that she was fighting tears now told me more than any words could have. "Mom," I said, my own throat tightening to the point of pain. "Whatever it is, you can tell me." She opened her mouth and then her eyes closed. The day had taken everything she had. Within 30 seconds, her breathing had slowed and steadied into sleep, her hand still wrapped around mine. I sat there for a long time after that, watching her chest rise and fall, trying to hold myself together with the same discipline I'd applied to everything else in my life. It didn't work as well as I needed it to. Eventually, I stepped into the hallway and called Samuel Reed. Samuel had been my attorney for 30 years, since the days when I needed someone to review my first mortgage, and he'd charge me half his rate because we'd grown up 3 streets apart. He was 68 now, semi-retired, with a voice like gravel, and a mind that still moved faster than most people half his age. He picked up on the second ring. "Nathan, it's late." "I know," I said. "Sam, I need you to come to the office tomorrow morning. Early." I paused. "I have a video you need to see, and I think my daughter-in-law has been trying to steal my mother's house." A long beat of quiet on the line. Then, "How early?" 7, I said. "I'll be there at 6:30, he said. "Bring the phone. Don't send that video to anyone tonight. Not Eric, not anyone. You hear me?" "I hear you." "Good." Another pause. "How's Eleanor?" I looked back through the small window in the door at my mother sleeping under the thin hospital blanket, her bruised face turned slightly toward the window. "She's tough," I said. "She's always been tougher than anyone gives her credit for." I meant it as a simple answer. I didn't know yet how completely true it was. Samuel arrived at my apartment at 6:28, 2 minutes early, which was exactly what I expected, from a man who had never once in 30 years kept anyone waiting. I had coffee ready. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, watched the video twice without a word, and then set the phone down with the careful deliberateness of someone handling evidence, which I was beginning to understand was exactly what it was. "She didn't know you were there," he said. "No. And you entered through an unlocked door using a key you've had for 12 years. "Yes." He nodded slowly, his jaw working. "Montana's a one-party consent state. You were present in that space, you had legal standing to be there. The recording holds." He picked up his coffee. "Nathan, this woman hit a 103-year-old woman and then staged a rescue for her own camera within 60 seconds. That's not a loss of temper, that's a pattern. We were still at the table 2 hours later when someone knocked at my door. I opened it to find a woman I recognized from the neighborhood, Linda Parker, who lived directly across from my mother's house, and beside her, a 15-year-old girl with her mother's dark eyes and an expression of someone who had made a difficult decision and was committed to seeing it through. "Mr. Brooks," the girl said. "My name is Lily. I don't know if you remember me." "I remember you," I said. "Come in." Linda Parker explained quickly she'd heard about the ambulance the night before through the neighborhood, the way news travels in small towns before anyone has to make a single phone call. Lily had come to her mother that morning and told her there was something Mr. Brooks needed to see. Lily set a small USB drive on my kitchen table. "Our doorbell camera points at our front porch," she said, "but the angle also catches the side entrance of your mom's house. I noticed it a few months ago when I was checking the footage after somebody knocked over our recycling bin." She pushed the drive toward me. "I started saving the clips. I didn't know what else to do with them." Samuel plugged it into his laptop. What came next turned my kitchen into the quietest room I had ever sat in. The footage spanned 4 months. In clip after clip, the truth of my mother's daily life revealed itself without commentary or narration, just timestamp and image. Vanessa wheeling Eleanor to the side porch in a thin cardigan and leading her there, returning 53 minutes later. Eleanor's hands gripping the armrests of the wheelchair, the whole time her shoulders hunched against the cold. Another clip, Vanessa removing a medication bag from the kitchen counter and placing it in the trash can beside the garage. Then, 20 minutes later, setting up her phone on its stand and filming herself searching the kitchen with exaggerated worry, opening and closing cupboards, shaking her head. Another Vanessa carrying a bowl of soup to Eleanor, setting it on the tray table, positioning the phone to capture the moment, 3 careful spoonfuls, a warm smile for the camera, then picking up the bowl and walking back to the kitchen the moment the recording stopped. Lily sat across from me with her hands folded in her lap, watching my face. She was 15 years old. She had done this alone quietly for 4 months because something had told her it mattered. I didn't know if I should say anything, She said, her voice smaller now. She's somebody's grandma. My eyes burned. I pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of my nose and breathed through it because I was not going to fall apart in front of this child who had just handed me the most important thing anyone had given me in years. You did the right thing, Lily, I said. You did exactly the right thing. The last clip on the drive was dated 3 weeks prior. A man in a dark suit jacket arriving at the front door at 9:17 in the evening carrying a manila folder. Inside for 51 minutes. Leaving without the folder. Samuel looked at me over the top of his laptop screen. I need to find out who that man is, I said. Already on it, Samuel replied, reaching for his phone. Samuel called me Monday morning at 7:45. Me Gerald Marsh, he said without preamble. 52 years old, licensed notary public in Cascade County, been practicing for 19 years. 2 formal complaints filed against him in the last decade, one in 2017, one in 2021. Both involved allegations of notarizing documents without properly verifying the signer's identity or competency. Neither complaint resulted in license revocation. A pause. He got a written reprimand both times, slap on the wrist. I was standing in my kitchen with my second cup of coffee going cold in my hand. What kind of documents? First complaint, a property transfer. Elderly woman in Great Falls. Family said she didn't understand what she was signing. Second, a financial power of attorney. Similar circumstances. Samuel's voice was flat, and even the way it got when he was angry, but keeping it contained. Nathan, without a licensed notary, none of Vanessa's documents can be legally recorded at the county level. Marsh isn't a supporting player in this. He's the mechanism that makes the whole machine run. I set the coffee cup down on the counter before I dropped it. Can we connect him directly to Vanessa? We already have, Samuel said. The USB footage puts him at the house. I cross-referenced his vehicle registration, dark blue Buick Enclave 2019. Matches what Lily's camera captured. Another pause. I also called Dorothy Hawkins this morning. Dot. Of course Samuel had called Dot. She confirmed it. He continued. She saw that same car parked in front of Eleanor's house on 4 separate evenings over the past 3 months. Always after 9, always gone before 10:30. I walked to the window and stood looking out at the street below, the morning traffic moving slowly through the intersection, ordinary life continuing at its ordinary pace, while everything I thought I knew about my family sat in pieces around me. My throat was so tight it was an effort to speak. 4 visits, I said. At minimum, those are just the ones Dot saw. Samuel cleared his throat. Nathan, I want you to understand what this pattern suggests. Marsh wasn't coming to the house for social calls. He was coming to review documents, walk Vanessa through the notarization process, and likely to assess Eleanor's condition to determine whether she could be pressured into signing without triggering a legal challenge afterward. The image of my mother sitting in that wheelchair with Vanessa's hand around her wrist rose up behind my eyes, and I pressed them shut and breathed through my nose until the sharpest edge of it passed. He was deciding if she was vulnerable enough, I said. Yes, Samuel said. That's exactly what he was doing. I drove to Samuel's office that afternoon, and we sat across from each other at his conference table with Lily's USB footage running on his laptop and a yellow legal pad between us, filling up with notes. Samuel had been practicing law in Red Willow for 38 years. His office smelled like old paper and coffee, and the particular kind of order that belongs to a man who has never once misfiled anything in his life. On the wall behind his desk were framed photographs, his law school graduation, his late wife at a camping trip somewhere in the Beartooth Range, and a picture of the 2 of us at a fishing spot on the Smith River the summer I turned 40. I had trusted this man with every significant legal decision of my adult life. Watching him work, now methodical, precise, his reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead, as he studied the footage frame by frame, I felt a gratitude so acute it was almost painful. Here's what concerns me most, he said, tapping the legal pad. Marsh has done this before. Not with Vanessa specifically, but the pattern elderly person property transfer complaint filed too late to stop the transaction. He knows exactly how much pressure to apply and how to document it so it looks voluntary. He looked up at me. We need to move before he comes back. How much time do we have? I don't know yet, but Dot mentioned something that stuck with me. He flipped back a page on the legal pad. She said the last time she saw Marsh's car, Vanessa walked him to the door and said something about the end of the month. Dot didn't hear the full sentence, just the end of the month. The end of August. 3.5 weeks. My jaw tightened until I felt it in my back teeth. Then we need to know everything Vanessa has filed. Every document, every petition, every piece of paper with my mother's name on it. Samuel was already reaching for his phone. I'll pull the county records tonight. If she's filed anything, it'll be in the system. He dialed then, covered the receiver, and looked at me. Nathan, whatever we find, we handle it correctly. No shortcuts, no confrontations. You let the paper tell the story. Follow the paper, I thought. Find the crack before the bridge comes down. I hear you, I said. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning, thinking about a 52-year-old man with 2 complaints on his record and a dark blue Buick, and wondering how many times he had done this before anyone bothered to look. Before I reveal what Samuel found in those court records, and trust me, nothing could have prepared me for this drop. A 7 in the comments right now, so I know you're still here with me. A quick note, this story contains some fictional elements woven in for storytelling purposes. If that's not something you'd like to continue with, this is a good place to step away, no hard feelings at all. Samuel called me Wednesday morning and said 4 words. Come in, right now. I was at his office in 11 minutes. He was standing at the conference table when I arrived, not sitting, standing, which told me everything I needed to know about what he had found before he said a single word. 3 manila folders were spread across the table in a row, each one open, each one covered in tabbed sticky notes in Samuel's precise handwriting. Sit down, he said. I'd rather stand. He looked at me for a moment, then nodded. All right, then hold on to something. He started with the first folder. It's 6 months ago, someone filed a petition with the county court to modify the management of Eleanor's trust and real property. The petition states that Eleanor's cognitive capacity has declined to the point where she can no longer make sound financial decisions. He tapped the document with one finger. It includes a supporting declaration from a licensed psychologist. Except that psychologist retired from practice 8 months ago and has been living in assisted care in Billings ever since. His signature on this document is a forgery. The room felt like it tilted slightly. I put my hand on the back of a chair. Second folder, Samuel said. A petition for limited guardianship over Eleanor's person and estate, filed 4 months ago, identifies Vanessa Brooks as the proposed guardian. He opened it to a flagged page. This one includes an authorization document granting Vanessa medical decision-making authority in emergency situations. It bears your signature, Nathan. I never signed anything, I said. My voice came out very quiet and very flat. I know. Samuel held my gaze. I had a handwriting analyst look at it this morning. Preliminary opinion, it's a forgery. We'll need formal confirmation, but the analyst was not uncertain. He moved to the third folder. This is the one that tells us what all of it was for. He opened it to a flagged page and turned it toward me. It was a purchase and sale agreement. The property listed was my mother's house, the house my grandfather had built in 1948. The house Eleanor had lived in for more than 70 years. The purchase price was listed at $240,000. The assessed market value of that property was $710,000. The buyer, Samuel said, is an entity called Willow Crest Holdings, LLC. Registered in Montana 8 months ago. He paused. I pulled the registration. The sole member and owner of Willow Crest Holdings is Vanessa Brooks. I stared at the document. My hands had started shaking again, that deep involuntary tremor I'd felt in the hospital waiting room, and I gripped the back of the chair hard enough that my knuckles went white. She had set up a company, in her own name, to buy my mother's house from my mother at 1/3 of its value and then sell it to a resort developer for 3 times market rate. The whole architecture of it built, piece by careful piece over 8 months, designed to look like a family decision made in Eleanor's best interests. The guardianship petition, I said. What's the status? The court appointed a guardian ad litem 6 weeks ago, standard procedure when a petition like this is filed. The gal is required to interview Eleanor independently and assess her capacity. Samuel's jaw tightened. I filed a formal objection this morning on your behalf, along with Dr. Osei's medical records confirming Eleanor's full cognitive competency. The court has suspended the petition pending review. He looked at me steadily. Nathan, I also need you to go through every signature in these folders, every page that bears your name. I need you to confirm for the record which ones are yours and which ones are not. I spent the next 40 minutes going through those documents page by page, my stomach turning harder with each forged signature. My handwriting approximated closely enough that a casual review might have missed it, but wrong in the specific ways that 40 years of signing engineering reports had made my signature unmistakable to me. Each time I came to one, I said the same thing, not mine. Samuel noted it on the legal pad without comment. When we were done, Dr. Osei called. "I've prepared the formal documentation confirming Eleanor's cognitive status," he said. "Full capacity orientation memory judgment, all within normal parameters for her age. I'll have it to you by end of day." A brief pause. "Nathan, how is she?" "Angry," I said. "Which means she's fine." Osei made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That tracks. I'll send the paperwork." After I hung up, I stood at Samuel's window, looking out at the street. A woman was walking a dog past the parking lot. A teenager on a bicycle cut across the corner without stopping. Ordinary Wednesday in a small Montana town. "Sam," I said, "I need to know something." "Ask." "How do we make sure she can't file anything else? Can't move, money can't record a deed, can't do anything with that property before we're ready?" Samuel picked up his pen. "I file for an emergency ex parte asset freeze with the district court today. Ex parte means the order is issued without notifying Vanessa standard procedure in elder financial exploitation cases under Montana Code, Section 72-5101. The court can approve it within 24 to 48 hours. Once it's in place, no transaction involving Eleanor's property or accounts can be completed without court approval." "Do it," I said. "Already drafting it." He looked up. "And Nathan, I'm referring this to the FBI, wire fraud, financial exploitation, forgery. This crosses into federal territory." I nodded. Something cold and steady had settled over me, the feeling I recognized from the worst days on job sites when the crisis was real, and the only useful thing left was to be precise. The folders were still spread across the table when I left. 3 separate documents, 3 separate angles of attack, all pointing at the same target. My grandfather's house, my mother's home. I had spent 40 years finding cracks before they brought things down. I had found this one. Now I needed to make sure it didn't close before I was ready to use it. Agent Carol Simmons arrived at Samuel's office at 9 o'clock Friday morning, and she arrived alone, which Samuel told me afterward was deliberate. A single agent at an initial evidence review creates less disruption and puts witnesses more at ease than a team. She was 44 years old, medium height, with close-cropped brown hair and the kind of face that gave nothing away without choosing to. She wore a plain gray blazer and carried a leather portfolio that she set on the conference table before shaking my hand with a grip that was brief and firm and entirely businesslike. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "I've reviewed the documents Mr. Reed sent over. Before we go further, I want to see the video and the USB footage." "All of it?" I asked. "All of it," she said. We sat at the conference table, Samuel on one side, Simmons and I across from each other, and for the next 90 minutes, she watched everything. The video from my phone first. She watched it twice, her expression unchanging, her pen moving steadily across the notepad in front of her. Then Lily's USB footage, clip by clip, timestamp by timestamp. When she reached the segment showing Vanessa carrying the soup bowl back to the kitchen, the moment her own camera stopped recording. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Simmons's jaw, a tightening so brief I almost missed it. The last clip she watched 3 times. The man in the suit jacket, the manila folder, 51 minutes inside the house. "Gerald Marsh," Samuel said. Simmons looked up. "You've already identified him." Vehicle registration cross-referenced with the footage. Dark blue Buick Enclave 2019. 2 prior complaints with the State Notary Licensing Board. Samuel slid a printed summary across the table. Pattern consistent with targeting elderly property owners. Simmons studied the summary for a moment, then set it aside. She looked at me directly, and I had the feeling of being assessed not unkindly but thoroughly. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "I want to explain why the FBI has jurisdiction here, because it matters for how we proceed. The moment Vanessa Brooks used electronic communication, phone, email, text to coordinate any part of this scheme, it became wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343, federal statute. That gives us authority to investigate regardless of state lines." She paused. "The shell company Willow Crest Holdings adds a layer of financial fraud. The forged signatures on federal adjacent documents add forgery. This is not a domestic property dispute. This is a federal case." "How long will an investigation take?" I asked. "That depends on what else we find." She made a note. "The financial picture is what I want next. I want to know where her money comes from, where it goes, and whether there are any external pressures driving the timeline. She looked up. You mentioned she referenced the end of the month. That suggests a deadline she didn't create herself. That's what we believe, Samuel said. Then I want to know who she owes. Simmons closed her portfolio. One more thing. The footage was collected by a minor, Lily Parker. I'll need a formal statement from her. Her parents will need to be present and will need to sign consent documentation. Her mother already knows, I said. She was there when Lily brought the drive to me. Simmons nodded. Good. I'll reach out to the family directly. She gathered her things and stood. Mr. Brooks, I want to be clear about something. We have enough here for an arrest warrant today. The video alone establishes elder abuse. The forged documents establish forgery and fraud. She held my gaze steadily. But if we move now, her defense will argue the fraud was never completed. The property was never transferred. The notarization was never finalized. A good defense attorney turns that into reasonable doubt. I understood immediately. You want her to take the last step herself. I want her to try to complete the transaction, Simmons said. That seals every charge. Attempted plus completed. There's no room left to argue intent. This isn't entrapment. She added, reading something in my expression. Entrapment means we induce someone innocent to commit a crime they never intended. Vanessa created her own intent 18 months ago. We're simply letting her finish what she started. She picked up her portfolio, which means we need a reason for Eleanor to appear willing to sign, something convincing enough that Vanessa moves forward on her own timeline. She looked at me waiting. My phone was on the table in front of me. Eric's name had appeared on the screen twice that morning, 2 unanswered calls I hadn't been ready to take. I picked it up now and looked at it thinking about my son, thinking about what he knew and what he didn't, and what he was afraid to find out. I'll call my son, I said. Samuel looked at me carefully. Nathan. She trusts him completely, I said. And right now, he trusts her. I set the phone back down. That's about to become her problem. Simmons studied me for a moment, then gave a single, precise nod. Keep me informed of every step before you take it. Nothing moves without coordination. Understood, I said. She left. The office was quiet except for the sound of a truck shifting gears on the street outside. Samuel poured himself a second cup of coffee and sat back down at the table, looking at the stack of folders between us. You realize, he said carefully, that calling Eric means telling him nothing. He passes along whatever Vanessa expects to hear, and nothing more. I know, I said. And if he asks questions? He won't, I said. The certainty of it sat in my chest like a stone. Eric has spent months not asking questions. He's very good at it. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then, this is going to hurt him. Yes, I said. It is. I looked at the cracked phone screen on the table, the same crack Vanessa had put there, and thought about all the things a person tells themselves when they don't want to see what's in front of them. I had done it too once. Called it trust. Called it giving people the benefit of the doubt. I understood now that there is a difference between trust and willful blindness, and that the difference matters most when someone you love is the one paying the price for it. The Thursday call came while I was somewhere between Garrison and Helena on Route 89, hauling a half-load of rebar to a bridge repair site north of the city. I had taken extra shifts that week on purpose. Not because I needed the money, though the money never hurt, but because I needed something to do with my hands and my body while my mind worked through everything Samuel and I had put in motion. Driving helped. There was something about the long, straight Montana highways, the way they stretched out ahead of you for miles before the next curve, that made thinking feel less like circling and more like moving forward. The call came through the truck speakers at 2:17 in the afternoon, Simmons' name on the display. I signaled, eased onto the wide gravel shoulder, cut the engine, and sat with the windows down, and the August heat pressing in from all sides, the dry, baking heat of the high desert in summer, smelling of sage and dust and hot asphalt. She talked for 14 minutes. I did not interrupt once. Her name appears on 3 separate loan agreements, Simmons said. Her voice through the speakers was precise and level, the voice she used when she was giving you information she had already organized completely in her own mind. All of them with private lending organizations, not banks, not credit unions. Private lenders who operate in a legal gray area and do significantly less verification than a regulated institution would. A pause just long enough to let the distinction land. The total outstanding balance across all 3 loans is $412,000. The number landed in the cab of that truck like something physical. I put my hand flat on the dashboard and press down the way I had pressed my hand against the rail of a bridge once to feel whether the vibration was in the structure or in my imagination. It was in the structure then. It was in me now. She borrowed against the house, I said. She represented to each lender that she was in the process of acquiring the property, Simmons said. Showed them the Willowcrest purchase agreement as evidence of a pending asset. The lenders accepted it without verifying current ownership through the county recorder's office, which a legitimate institution would have required. Her voice stayed level. What she told them was fraudulent. She had no ownership interest in that property and no legal standing to pledge it as collateral. Under federal statute that constitutes fraudulent misrepresentation, she induced those lenders to extend credit based on a material lie. I stared at the highway ahead of me. A truck passed going the other direction, rocking my cab slightly with the displacement of air, and was gone. And the deadline? I asked, though I already felt the answer forming in my chest like a stone dropping into cold water. I had known there was a deadline Dot had heard Vanessa say at the end of the month, but hearing the number from Simmons made it real in a different way. The first loan comes due August 31st, she said. The second follows September 7th. If she doesn't complete the property transfer before the end of this month, she defaults on the first loan. The lenders have already initiated preliminary default proceedings. We found the paperwork. Another pause. Nathan, she isn't just greedy. She is in serious financial trouble that she created for herself over the course of 18 months, and she chose your mother as the way out. Outside, a hawk turned slow circles above the dry grass on the ridgeline, riding a thermal without effort going nowhere in particular. I watched it and tried to absorb what I was being told. The hawk didn't care about loan agreements or property values or elderly women in wheelchairs. It was just riding the warm air doing what hawks do. There was something almost peaceful about that, and I needed to look at it for a moment before I could keep listening. Vanessa had borrowed $412,000. She had used a house she had never owned, and would never legally own, as the foundation of that debt, showing a fraudulent purchase agreement to 3 different private lenders who had each handed her money without doing the basic work of checking whether the asset actually existed in her name. And when the weight of that debt had become too much to carry alone, when the first default date had begun to loom on the calendar like a wall she couldn't see over, she had looked at a 103-year-old woman in a wheelchair and made a calculation. The calculation was simple. Eleanor was old. Eleanor was frail. Eleanor might be frightened into signing, or pressured into it, or worn down by enough weeks of isolation and hunger and cold porches until her resistance gave out. And once the signature was on the paper and Gerald Marsh had put his notary stamp on it, Willowcrest Holdings, LLC, would own the property for $240,000. Vanessa would then sell it to the resort developer for a number that would clear her debts and leave her with change to spare. It was a plan. A real plan built over 18 months with legal documents and a shell company and a corrupt notary and a social media presence designed to make 40,000 strangers believe she was an angel. She was drowning, I said. Yes, Simmons said, and she decided Eleanor was the life raft. My jaw ached. I realized I had been clenching it through her entire summary and made a conscious effort to release it, pressing my tongue against the back of my teeth and breathing slowly through my nose the way I had learned to breathe on construction sites when the findings were bad and the consequences were serious, and panic was the least useful thing available. What does this do to the case? I asked. It establishes motive in a way that's very difficult to argue around, Simmons said. Juries understand desperation. They understand that people do things under financial pressure that they might not do otherwise. But understanding a motive doesn't excuse a crime, it contextualizes it. And in this case, the financial pressure she was under makes the premeditation clearer, not less clear. A brief pause. She didn't snap. She planned. She planned for 18 months across 3 separate loan agreements using forged documents and a fraudulent company structure. That is not a person who lost control. That is a person who made choices. 8 months, I said. Then I corrected myself. 18 months. At minimum, the first loan was taken out 18 months ago. The company was registered 8 months ago. The court filing started 6 months ago. Another pause. The timeline tells the story, Nathan. Every step of this was deliberate. I closed my eyes. 18 months. While Vanessa had been posting videos of herself brushing my mother's silver hair and collecting comment after comment about what an angel she was, while I had been watching those videos in my apartment after long delivery shifts and feeling complicated gratitude and guilt, she had been 18 months deep into a plan to take everything Eleanor had ever owned. The house my grandfather had built. the trust my mother had maintained for decades, the property that was the physical record of our family's presence in this valley going back 3 generations. All of it reduced to a line item in a loan agreement that Vanessa had signed with money she didn't have secured by an asset she didn't own, counting on a woman she had decided was too old and too tired and too alone to stop her. "Sam needs to hear this today," I said. "I'm calling him next," Simmons said. "Nathan, are you still set on the approach we discussed, letting her believe Eleanor is willing to sign?" "Yes," I said. The certainty of it was the same certainty I felt when a structural assessment was complete and the load path was clear. You knew what the structure needed. You committed to the repair. "Yes, absolutely. Then we need to move on the asset freeze and the trap documents this week. She has 17 days until her first default. She will be pushing hard, harder than before, now that the clock is running in a way she can hear." A brief pause. "One more thing. I ran Eric Brooks through our financial systems. No connection to the loans, no transfers between his accounts and the lenders, no communications we can find linking him to the financial fraud." She let that settle for a moment. "As of now, he's not a target. That could change depending on what else surfaces, but currently he doesn't appear to have known about the money." "He didn't," I said. The certainty of that was one of the few things I still felt sure about. There were a lot of things I had been wrong about Vanessa chief among them, but I did not believe my son had known about the loans. Eric is many things right now, but he's not that. "All right," Simmons said. "Then he's a witness, not a defendant. Keep that in mind when you talk to him." I thanked her and ended the call. I sat in the truck on the shoulder of Route 89 for a long time. After that, long enough that another driver slowed down, rolled his window down, and leaned out to ask if I needed help. I waved him off, managed something that probably looked like a reassuring smile to a stranger who couldn't see my eyes, and waited until his truck had pulled back onto the highway and disappeared around the long curve to the north, before I let my head drop back against the headrest and looked up at the roof of the cab. $412,000, 18 months of planning, a purchase agreement for a house that wasn't hers, shown to lenders who hadn't looked closely enough, all of it built on the assumption that a 103-year-old woman could be frightened or pressured or simply worn down until she gave up. What Vanessa had not accounted for, what she could not have known, because she had looked at my mother and seen only age and frailty and a body that shook when it reached for a coffee cup, was that Eleanor Brooks had survived the Depression as a child, buried a husband, raised a son alone, and spent 103 years on this earth without ever once giving up something she had decided to hold. And she had a son who had spent 40 years learning to find the crack in a structure before it brought everything down. I started the engine. The rebar in the bed of the truck shifted slightly as I pulled back onto the highway, settling into its load. The weight of it was familiar. I had been hauling construction materials for 2 years, and I knew exactly what the truck felt like under a full load versus a partial one, how it handled differently on curves, how the brakes responded. You learn to read weight after a while. You learn to know what something costs before it breaks. I called Samuel from the road. He picked up before the first ring had finished. "Simmons just called me," he said without hello. "Nathan, we need to meet tonight." "I know," I said. "I'm already on my way." Samuel's office at 9 o'clock that evening looked different from how it looked during business hours. The overhead lights were off. He had switched on the 2 desk lamps instead, and they threw warm pools of light across the conference table where the 3 of us sat, Samuel Simmons and me, with coffee going cold in paper cups, and the Willow Crest document spread between us like a map of a battle we hadn't fought yet. Outside, Red Willow had gone quiet, the way small Montana towns go quiet on August evenings, just the occasional car on Main and the distant sound of someone's screen door. "We have 17 days, Simmons said. "Possibly fewer if she's already in contact with Marsh about a signing date. Then we build the trap to fit the timeline," Samuel said. He had a fresh legal pad in front of him, and he wrote as he talked, his handwriting small and precise. "Here's what I'm proposing. I draft a document entirely legitimate in its form and language that reflects Eleanor's willingness to enter into a discussion about the property transfer, not a commitment, not a signature, an expression of openness." He looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. "Nathan, I want to be clear about what this document is and is not. It creates no legal obligation for Eleanor. It transfers nothing. It is in the most technical sense a letter of intent to have a conversation. Vanessa will read it as the green light she's been waiting for. And she'll move fast," Simmons said. "She has to," Samuel said. The clock is running. I nodded. My hands were flat on the table in front of me, and I was working to keep them still. What about the property itself? If she manages to get something in front of a notary before we're ready. She can't, Simmons said. The district court approved the emergency ex parte asset freeze this afternoon. It went through in just under 30 hours. She slid a copy of the order across the table toward me. Ex parte means it was issued without notifying Vanessa Standard Procedure under Montana Code, Section 72-5101, when there's credible evidence of elder financial exploitation. No transaction involving Eleanor's property or accounts can be completed or recorded without explicit court approval. Marsh could notarize every document in the county, and none of them would hold. I picked up the court order and read the first paragraph twice. The words blurred slightly, not from emotion, I told myself, but from the lateness of the hour and the inadequate light. There's one more piece, Samuel said. Eleanor, she needs to know, I said immediately. She needs to know, and she needs to agree, Samuel said. We're not doing anything in her name without her consent. She is 103 years old and fully competent, and she has the right to decide whether she wants to participate in this. We drove to the hospital together that night. Eleanor was awake when we arrived, propped up against her pillows with the television off and a paperback novel face down on the blanket beside her, which told me she had been thinking rather than reading. She looked at me, and then at Samuel, and then back at me with the expression she had worn my entire life when she knew something significant was about to be said. Sit down, both of you, she said. You're making me nervous hovering like that. I sat. I told her everything, not a summary everything. The 3 folders, the forged signatures, Willow Crest Holdings, the $400,000, the deadline, the court order, the plan. Samuel filled in the legal details where I stumbled. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her eyes moving between us, her hands folded in her lap, with a stillness that I recognized as her version of iron self-control. When I finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Eleanor looked down at her folded hands. Then she looked up at me and said, "Do what you need to do, Nathan. I trust you completely." Her voice was steady, but her chin trembled once quickly before she controlled it, and that small involuntary movement hit me somewhere behind the sternum, harder than anything else that had happened in the past 2 weeks. "Mom, don't," she said firmly. "Don't apologize. None of this is your fault, and I won't sit here and watch you carry it like it is." She reached out and gripped my hand. "You found it. That's what matters." I called Eric the following morning at 7:45. He picked up on the 3rd ring, his voice carrying the careful quality of a man who had been expecting a call he didn't know how to prepare for. "Dad, Eric." I kept my voice even unhurried, the way I'd learned to keep it on job sites when something had gone wrong and panic was the least useful response available. "I've been thinking about what happened, about the family. I don't want this to tear everything apart." A pause. "Okay," he said carefully. "If Vanessa has been the one showing up every day, if she's been carrying that weight, then maybe I've been looking at this the wrong way." I let that sit for a moment. "I think we should let Grandma sign." The silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds. Then I heard Eric exhale a long, slow breath that carried something in it I couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe. Or the specific relief of a man who had been holding a door closed against something heavy and had just been told he could put it down. "Vanessa's going to want to make it official," he said. "She'll want the family there, everyone. The more people, the better," I said. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with the phone in my hand and the morning light coming through the window, and I thought about my grandfather, who had built the house on the north edge of Red Willow with his own hands over the course of a single summer, working from a set of plans he had drawn himself on butcher paper. He had told me once that the secret to building anything that lasts was to know exactly where you were putting every load before you committed the weight to it. I had committed the weight. Now I needed every beam to hold. Dot called me the morning after I spoke to Eric. I was in the parking lot of the pharmacy, picking up a refill of Eleanor's heart medication when my phone rang. Dot's voice on the other end was different from her usual tone, quieter, and carrying the particular weight of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has finally decided the time for holding it is over. "Nathan," she said, "I need you to come by the house today. There's something Eleanor asked me to give you. She asked me 6 months ago, and she made me promise not to say anything unless—" She stopped. "Unless something happened." And something happened. I was at her front door in 20 minutes. Dot's house was the mirror image of my mother's in almost every way. Same era, same floor, plan, different wallpaper, and a lifetime of different photographs on the walls. She brought me to the kitchen table without ceremony and set a plain white envelope in front of me. My name was written on the front in my mother's handwriting, the handwriting I had known since I was 4 years old. Careful and slightly forward-leaning, the letters formed with the deliberateness of a woman who had learned penmanship in a one-room schoolhouse in 1931. Dot sat down across from me. "She brought it to me in February," she said. She walked across the street herself. She was still getting around with the walker then. She put it in my hands and she said, "Dot, if anything happens to me, or if Nathan ever needs to know something, I haven't been able to tell him you give him this." Dot's voice thinned at the edges. She made me promise not to open it, so I didn't. I looked at the envelope for a long moment. My hands, when I picked it up, were not entirely steady. Inside were 7 pages torn from a yellow legal pad covered front and back in my mother's handwriting. The handwriting was smaller than it used to be and occasionally uneven, the hand of a woman whose grip had grown unreliable, but every word was legible. Every word was precise. She had dated each entry. The first was from October of the previous year, October the 14th. V came into the bedroom at 9 this evening and asked me again about the property documents. I told her I would not sign anything without Nathan reading it first. She said Nathan doesn't care about this house the way she does. She held my wrist when she said it, not gently. I read that entry twice. Then I turned the page. November 3rd. V took my afternoon medication and put it somewhere. When I asked her where it was, she said I had already taken it. I had not. I know my own medication schedule. I have taken the same pills at the same times for 11 years. December 19th. She left me on the side porch for a long time today. I counted it was 50 minutes. I was cold. When she finally came back, she said I had asked to go outside. I did not ask to go outside. Page after page, entry after entry, each one dated, each one specific, each one written in the careful, measured language of a woman who understood that what she was writing might one day matter in a way she couldn't yet predict. January 8th. I told Dot today that I was worried. Dot wanted to call Nathan. I asked her not to. I was afraid that if V knew Nathan had been told, she would find ways to make sure I couldn't speak to anyone. I am not as helpless as she thinks I am, but I am also not as safe as I used to be. My throat had closed by the 3rd page. By the 5th, I had to set the papers down and press the heels of both hands against my eyes and breathe. Just breathe, because the alternative was to come apart completely at Dorothy Hawkins' kitchen table, and I was not going to do that. I was going to hold myself together long enough to finish reading what my mother had written for me. The last entry was from 3 weeks before the Friday afternoon I had come home early from a canceled delivery. July 11th. I don't know how much longer I can keep this record without her finding it. I keep it in the lining of my winter coat in the closet she never opens, because she says it smells like mothballs. I am tired, Nathan. I want to tell you everything, but every time I think about saying it out loud, I think about what happens after I do, and I get afraid. Not for me, for you. You would come in like a storm, and she would find a way to use that against you. So I write it down instead. I write it down, and I trust that you will find it when you need it. If you are reading this, you found it. I am glad. I set the last page down on the table. Dot reached across and placed her hand over mine, her fingers warm and papery and solid, and she didn't say anything, which was exactly right because there was nothing to say. I had thought I was protecting my mother. I had thought that I was the one who had seen the danger and moved to address it. And I had, but Eleanor Brooks had been protecting herself and protecting me and documenting everything with the quiet, methodical patience of a woman who had survived the Depression and raised a family and buried a husband and lived 103 years on this earth. And she had done it alone in the lining of a winter coat because she was afraid that telling me would make things worse. My eyes were burning so badly I could barely see. I pressed my lips together and breathed through my nose and stared at a fixed point on Dorothy's kitchen wall. A small watercolor of a mountain meadow that had been there as long as I could remember until I had enough of myself back to speak. "I need to call Samuel," I said. My voice came out rough and uneven, nothing like the voice I used on job sites or in courtrooms or anywhere else that required steadiness. Dot squeezed my hand. "Use my kitchen," she said. "Take as long as you need." I called Samuel. He picked up on the second ring. "Sam," I said, "Eleanor had evidence. She's been keeping it for 6 months." I stopped, steadied myself. She wrote down everything, every date, every incident, every word. The line was quiet for a moment. When Samuel spoke, his voice had the particular quality it got when something had genuinely moved him, lower than usual and slower. "Nathan," he said. That changes everything. I know, I said. And then because I had been holding it since the third page, she did it to protect me, Sam. She was 102 years old, and she was protecting me. She called it a family gathering. What she built was a stage. I arrived at the house at 6:45, 15 minutes before the guests were due, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at what Vanessa had done to the place my grandfather had built. String lights had been wound through the porch railing. A catering van was parked in the driveway. Through the front windows, I could see white tablecloths and flower arrangements, and the warm glow of candles, and for a moment, just a moment, I felt the dizzying wrongness of it, the obscenity of watching someone decorate a trap. I was wearing my work clothes. I had chosen them deliberately, the same canvas pants and flannel shirt I wore on delivery runs, still carrying the faint smell of diesel and sawdust. Vanessa had wanted a performance. I was going to give her a different kind. Inside, 60 people moved through the rooms of my mother's house, most of them faces. I recognized cousins, neighbors, people from the church Eleanor had attended for 50 years. A few of Eric's colleagues from the county office. A catering company had set up a buffet along the dining room wall. Someone had arranged a projection screen at the far end of the living room, the one I had requested through Eric 10 days ago, framed as a way to display family photographs and property documents for the occasion. Vanessa had agreed immediately. Of course she had. Simmons was already inside. I had confirmed it with a text 20 minutes earlier. She and her partner were positioned in the back bedroom, the door slightly ajar with a clear line of sight to the living room. State police were staged 2 blocks away, ready on her signal. Samuel stood near the kitchen doorway, his reading glasses in his breast pocket, a cup of coffee in his hand, looking for all the world like a retired attorney attending a family event. Dot was there too, seated near the window, in the second row of chairs, her best cardigan, her hands folded in her lap. She caught my eye when I came in and gave me a nod so small it was barely a movement at all. Then Vanessa entered. She came through the hallway from the back of the house, and the room shifted the way rooms shift when someone has engineered their own entrance. She was wearing a white dress, not a formal gown, but deliberately chosen, deliberately simple, the kind of white that reads as purity and selflessness on camera. Her hair was down. She was smiling the smile I had seen in 400 social media videos, the one that looked like warmth and felt up close like a calculation. Behind her, moving slowly, was Eleanor in her wheelchair. Vanessa had her hands on the handles guiding her in, and she was bending slightly forward to say something close to Eleanor's ear, something that made Vanessa smile wider, but that made my mother's jaw tighten in a way so small that only someone who had known her face for 65 years would catch it. Vanessa brought Eleanor to the front of the room and stood beside her, one hand resting on my mother's shoulder, and she raised her voice to carry to the whole gathering. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she said. "This family means everything to me, and Eleanor." She paused, her eyes going soft and bright in a way that I recognize now as practiced. Eleanor has always been the heart of it. Tonight she's asked me to take on the responsibility of protecting this home and everything it represents. I want everyone here to witness that. Applause. Genuine applause from people who had no reason yet to know better. Vanessa looked across the room and found me. For just a moment, her eyes stopped moving and fixed on mine, and there was something in that look, not triumph exactly, but the close cousin of it, the look of someone who believes they have already won. She raised the microphone slightly and said, her voice carrying the sweet, sorrowful tone of someone delivering a difficult truth. "There are people who love a family from a distance, who appear when there's something to be claimed and disappear when the work needs doing. I want everyone here to understand that for the past 4 years, I have been the one doing the work. Every morning, every night, every time Eleanor needed someone, I was here. People shifted in their seats. A few looked at me. My face did not change. I had decided sometime in the 9 days since I'd called Eric that I was not going to give Vanessa the reaction she was building toward. I was not going to flush with anger or look away or leave the room. I was going to stand in my work clothes in the corner of my mother's living room, and I was going to let her finish. Eric stood beside his wife near the front. He was watching her with an expression I had been trying to read since I walked in. Something complicated moving behind his eyes. Something that looked less like pride and more like a man who has been holding his breath for a very long time and is not sure he remembers how to stop. Vanessa turned back to the room and nodded to Samuel, who moved to the table and set down the folder of documents he had carried in. "Let's get this done," she said warmly, and the room rustled with anticipation. She crossed to Eleanor's wheelchair, crouched beside it, and said something that didn't reach the microphone. My mother's expression didn't change. Vanessa straightened, picked up the pen from the table, and placed it in Eleanor's hand with the careful tenderness of someone who knew exactly which cameras in the room were pointed at her. Eleanor looked down at the pen. The room went very quiet. I looked at Dot. She looked at me. Across the room, Samuel touched the side of his glasses, the signal we had agreed on. I looked at the projection screen at the far end of the living room. The laptop connected to it was open. The file was queued. Eleanor's hand tightened around the pen. Then she placed it on the table. She lifted her head and looked out at the 60 people gathered in her living room, the house her husband's father had built, the house she had lived in for more than 70 years. And she said in a voice that was quiet, but that carried to every corner of the room with the absolute clarity of a woman who has decided she is done being quiet. Before I sign anything, I want everyone in this room to see something. I need to go back. Because what happened when Eleanor set that pen down did not begin in that moment. It began 40 minutes earlier when Eric found me in the hallway near the back of the house and said in a voice pitched low enough that the nearest cluster of guests couldn't hear, "Dad, can we step outside for a minute?" We went out through the side door onto the narrow porch that ran along the east wall of the house, the one that faced Dot's place across the street. The August night was warm and dry, carrying the smell of cut grass and the faint diesel tang from the highway a mile out. Through the window behind us, the party continued the clink of glasses, Vanessa's laugh rising above the general murmur, the sound of 60 people who had no idea what was coming. Eric stood with his back against the porch railing, his arms crossed over his chest, not looking at me directly. His jaw was working the way it did when he was trying to organize something difficult into words. I had seen that expression on his face before the morning he told me he was getting married, the afternoon he called, to say he'd been passed over for a promotion he'd worked 2 years for. The expression of a man carrying weight he hasn't yet put down. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." "All right," I said. He exhaled slowly. 8 months ago, Vanessa gave me a stack of papers and asked me to sign them. She said they were administrative, something to do with Grandma's care plan, updating contact information and that kind of thing. He stopped, his jaw tightening. I signed them without reading them, all of them. She set the stack in front of me while I was eating breakfast, and I signed them. Because she asked me to, and because it was easier than asking questions. The night air moved between us. I kept my face still and my mouth shut the way I had promised. 3 weeks ago, Eric said, I found a text message on her phone. His voice dropped, cracking slightly at the edges. She'd left it on the kitchen counter, and it lit up while I was standing right there. The preview showed enough that I'd unlocked it and read the whole thing. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. His hand was not steady. She sent it to Marsh, the notary, the man I didn't know existed until 2 weeks ago when I started putting things together. He turned the screen toward me. The message was dated 3 weeks earlier, time-stamped at 11:47 in the evening. His father will never find out. By the time he does, the house is already ours. Make sure the documents are clean. I need this done before the 31st. I read it once. Then I looked up at my son. Eric's eyes were red-rimmed and bright, the look of a man who has been fighting tears for longer than tears are meant to be fought. His chin was trembling, a small, involuntary movement that he was clearly trying to control and couldn't quite manage. I confronted her, he said. The night I found it, I sat across from her at the kitchen table, and I read it out loud, and I asked her what it meant. He laughed, a short, hollow sound that had nothing of humor in it. She said she'd written it in frustration, that she didn't mean it literally, that she was exhausted from caring for Grandma, and sometimes she vented to people, and I was blowing it out of proportion. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment. And I let her explain it. I let her talk me back from the edge of it. Because believing her was easier than not believing her. Because if I stopped believing her, everything fell apart. I thought about what Samuel had said 2 weeks ago. He's a good man who chose not to look. Standing here on this porch looking at my son's face in the thin light coming through the window, I understood it differently now. It wasn't that Eric had chosen not to look. It was that looking had a cost he hadn't been ready to pay. "Dad!" he said, and his voice broke on the single syllable, cracking open at the middle in a way that made my chest ache with a pain I hadn't anticipated. I've been carrying this for 3 weeks, and I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know who I was supposed to be in this. I didn't know how to be your son and her husband at the same time when he stopped. His throat worked. When she was doing what she was doing. I put my hand on his shoulder. He flinched slightly at the contact, the way people do. when they've been braced for something harder. "Eric," I said, "look at me." He looked. "Tonight," I said, "you have a chance to choose differently than you chose before, but it has to be your choice. I can't make it for you, and I won't. You understand?" He nodded, his jaw set hard against whatever was happening behind his eyes. "Okay," he said. His voice had steadied, some essential decision having been made somewhere below the level of words. "Okay, Dad." We stood there for a moment, my hand on his shoulder, the warm August night around us, the party continuing just inside the window, and I thought about Bridges again the way I always do when things are at their most precarious. The moment before a load test, when the structure is committed, and the only thing left is to find out whether it holds. Then Eric straightened, drew a long breath, and pulled the door open. We went back inside. That is what happened 40 minutes before Eleanor set down the pen. And when the screen at the far end of the living room began to glow when the first image appeared, and the room went from festive murmur to the specific silence of 60 people, realizing simultaneously that something is very wrong. I was standing at the back of the room, and Eric was standing at the front, and neither of us looked at the other. We were both watching Vanessa. And for the first time since I had walked through that door on a Friday afternoon, 3.5 weeks ago, I felt something that wasn't anger or grief, or the cold clarity of a man running a controlled operation. I felt the particular ache of a father watching his son stand at the edge of something that is going to cost him, and knowing that the cost is necessary, and not being able to take it from him. Everything we had built, every piece of evidence, every quiet decision, every night I sat with a cracked phone screen, checking that the video was still there, it all came down to this one moment. Before I take you inside that room, comment ready below. I want to know you're with me. A note before we continue, some elements of this story have been fictionalized for storytelling. If this isn't the kind of content you're looking for, it's okay to step away now, but I promise what happens next will stay with you. The screen came to life. Not with fanfare, just a quiet brightening at the far end of the living room, the laptop opening the projector, warming up 60 people turning to look, because that's what people do when a screen lights up in a room. Vanessa turned to, her smile already arranged for whatever family photographs she expected to see. The first image was not a family photograph. It was a timestamp. August 1st Sedidwikes, in the afternoon. And then the video began. I had watched it so many times in the past 4 weeks that I knew every second of it, the angle from the hallway, the sound of Vanessa's voice before I had stepped into the room, the quality of light through the living room windows on a Friday afternoon. But watching it now projected large on the wall of my mother's house with 60 people in the room, it was different. It was the difference between reading about a thing and standing inside it. The room went quiet so fast it was almost physical, a collective intake of breath that didn't come back out. On the screen, Vanessa's voice filled the living room from the laptop speakers. "Sign it. What are you holding on to this house for? It's going to be ours anyway." Someone near the front made a sound, a small involuntary noise that was not quite a gasp and not quite a word. A woman near the window pressed her hand over her mouth. I watched the room the way I had learned to watch structures under load, looking for the points of failure, the places where things would give first. Vanessa had gone very still. The color was leaving her face in real time, draining downward, and her eyes were moving fast from the screen, to the room, to me, to Samuel, to the screen, again running the calculation, trying to find the exit. On the screen, Eleanor said, "This house will never belong to you," and then the sound of the slap. The room reacted as if the sound had landed on all of them at once. A man in the third row lurched forward in his chair. 3 people stood up. Someone said, "Oh my God," in a voice that didn't belong to anyone in particular and belonged to all of them simultaneously. An older woman near the back began to cry with the quiet helplessness of someone who doesn't realize they've started. Vanessa stepped forward. "That video has been edited," Samuel said from across the room. His voice was perfectly level, the voice of a man who has 38 years of practice saying difficult things in crowded rooms. I anticipated that response. The metadata on that file has been verified by a digital forensics specialist retained by the FBI. The timestamp, the file origin, the recording chain of custody, all of it is documented and intact. Vanessa's mouth closed. The screen changed. Lily's footage, now the doorbell camera, the timestamp from 3 months ago. Eleanor in the thin cardigan on the side porch, the wheelchair, the cold. 47 minutes of it, compressed into 90 seconds of footage that told its story without commentary. then the medication bag going into the trash, then Vanessa carrying the soup bowl to Eleanor, 3 careful spoonfuls for the camera, the warm smile, the recording, stopping the bowl, going back to the kitchen. The room was making sounds now that rooms aren't supposed to make, low collective sounds of comprehension and grief. The noise of 60 people understanding simultaneously that something terrible had been happening in this house, while they brought casseroles to the door and clicked like on social media posts. An older man near the window, Eleanor's cousin Raymond, who had driven 4 hours from Missoula for this, stood up and walked out of the room. He didn't say anything. He just stood and left his face doing something complicated that I didn't have words for. Then Dot stood up. She stood up from her chair in the second row, and she turned to face the room, and she said in the clear, strong voice of a 71-year-old woman who has decided she is done being a witness and is ready to be a participant, "I live across the street. I have lived across the street from Eleanor Brooks for 30 years. What you are seeing on that screen, I saw it with my own eyes. 3 times in 1 month, I watched her sit outside alone in the cold. I am a witness. I will say so in any court that asks me." The room absorbed this. Vanessa turned toward Dot with something in her eyes that was no longer the warm, practiced look of a woman performing selflessness. It was rawer than that, and uglier, and it lasted only a second before she caught it and tried to pull it back, but the room had seen it. Vanessa's voice was losing its shape. "This is a coordinated attack on my family. These people have been..." The screen changed again. Gerald Marsh, the dark blue Buick in the driveway. Timestamp 3 weeks ago. Vanessa at the front door, the manila folder passing between them, her voice picked up by Lily's camera microphone just clearly enough to make out the words, "Once the old lady signs, the house is mine before the 31st. Make sure everything is clean." A sound moved through the room like a wave. Then the final item on the screen, not video text. White background, black letters enlarged from a phone screenshot. A text message time-stamped 11:47 in the evening 3 weeks ago. His father will never find out. By the time he does, the house is already ours. Every person in the room read it. Then several of them turned to look at Eric. Eric was already moving. He stepped out from beside the buffet table and walked to the center of the room, and the crowd parted for him, the way crowds part for someone whose face says they are going to say something that cannot be unsaid. He stopped in the middle of the floor with 60 people looking at him, and he held up his phone and he said in a voice that shook badly on the first word and steadied on every word after, "I kept this for 3 weeks. I confronted her, and I let her explain it away because I was afraid of what it meant if I didn't." His throat worked. "I was a coward. I stood in this house and I chose the easier thing over the true thing, and my grandmother paid for that choice." He looked at Eleanor. His eyes were streaming, now tears running unchecked down his face, and he didn't wipe them away. "I'm done choosing the easier thing." He read the text message aloud, every word of it into the room, while Vanessa watched him with an expression I had never seen on a human face before and hoped not to see again. When he finished, the room was so quiet I could hear the catering van running in the driveway. Vanessa took a step toward her husband. "Eric, don't," he said. The door from the back hallway opened. Agent Simmons walked in, her partner a step behind her, both of them moving with the particular unhurried certainty of people who have done this before and know that hurrying makes it worse. Behind them, through the front door, 2 state police officers entered. Simmons crossed the room to Vanessa and said in a voice that was quiet and entirely without drama, "Vanessa Brooks, I have a warrant for your arrest." Vanessa turned to look at me. Across the room, through the 60 people between us, her eyes found mine, and for just a moment I saw something in them that wasn't anger or calculation. Something that might have been in another life, a person asking to be understood. I looked back at her steadily. She had hit my mother. She had planned it for 18 months. She had looked at a 103-year-old woman and decided she was a means to an end. There was nothing in me that moved toward her. When the handcuffs closed, she called Eric's name, once her voice high and breaking. He had turned away. He was looking at Eleanor, who was sitting in her wheelchair at the front of the room, with her hands folded in her lap and her chin level, and her eyes carrying the exhausted, undefeated expression of a woman who has been waiting a very long time for this particular moment to arrive. The house was quiet by 10 o'clock. The catering company had come back for their tables and their linens and their chafing dishes, loading them into the van with the efficient impersonality of people who have worked enough events to know when a night has gone wrong and to ask no questions about it. The string lights were still wound through the porch railing. Nobody had thought to take them down, and they glowed softly in the dark, long after the last car had pulled away from the curb, casting small, repeated circles of light across the empty porch that my grandfather had built. I sat on the front steps until almost midnight. I didn't go inside. I just sat there in the August dark with my hands loose between my knees, listening to the town settle around me, and I let the night do what nights are sometimes good for, which is absorbing things too large to process in the light. Simmons called me the following Tuesday. She had been thorough the way she was thorough about everything. The charges she read off had the clean, precise quality of something that had been built carefully over time and would not easily be dismantled. Vanessa Brooks has been charged with elder abuse under Montana Code, Section 52385, she said, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, forgery under Section 45-6-325-4, counts 1 for each document bearing a forged signature, wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343, which is the federal charge and carries the most significant sentencing exposure, and criminal conspiracy. A brief pause. Gerald Marsh was arrested yesterday morning. He's been charged with fraudulent notarizations, conspiracy, and 2 counts of forgery. His attorney has already reached out to our office about a cooperation agreement. Will he cooperate? I asked. Almost certainly, Simmons said. He has 2 prior complaints, and he knows what a jury does with a pattern. Cooperating is his best option. Another pause. The 3 private lenders have been referred to the Montana Division of Banking and Financial Institutions for investigation into their verification practices. That's a separate proceeding, but it's moving. And the emergency asset freeze has been converted to a permanent protective order, pending the conclusion of criminal proceedings. Eleanor's home is secure. No transaction can affect it without court approval. I heard the sound of papers being set down. Nathan, I want to say something that's outside the scope of the investigation. Go ahead. Your mother is remarkable, Simmons said, and her voice had shifted slightly, the professional register dropping just enough to let something genuine through. In 20 years of elder financial abuse cases, I have never encountered a victim who prepared her own corroborating evidence 6 months in advance, hid it in a coat lining, and then sat in a wheelchair in front of 60 people and held her nerve the way she held it last Saturday night. A brief pause. Whatever she needs going forward, if there's anything our victim services unit can provide, please reach out. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, with the phone face down in front of me and the coffee going cold in the cup. The way coffee always seems to go cold, at the moments when I most need it to stay warm. Eric came to the apartment 3 days after the arrest. I heard his truck in the parking lot before he knocked. I had always been able to identify it by the slight irregular knock in the engine that he had been meaning to get looked at for 2 years. He knocked twice, which was how he had knocked on doors since he was a boy, and I opened it and looked at my son standing in the hallway with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes carrying the specific exhausted quality of someone who has not been sleeping. I moved out, he said. I'm staying at Danny Pruitt's place over on 4th for now. Danny Pruitt, Eric's oldest friend, the one who had been his best man at the wedding. I nodded. Come in, I said. He came in and sat at the kitchen table, and I poured him coffee without asking, and set it in front of him, and he wrapped both hands around the cup and stared at the surface of it for a moment. Then he looked up. Dad, he said. I'm sorry. The words sat between us. I could hear what was in them, the genuine weight of it, the sleepless nights it had cost him, the particular exhaustion of a man who has looked clearly at something he did and found no way to make it smaller than it was. I thought about what I wanted to say. I had thought about it for days, actually turning it over on delivery runs in the apartment at night, on the front steps of my mother's house in the dark. What do you say to your son when he has done something that cannot be undone and is genuinely sorry for it? Trust is like a bridge, Eric, I said. You don't rebuild it with sorry. Sorry is just words. A bridge is built one beam at a time, one day at a time, over a long time, by a person who shows up every single day and does the work even when nobody's watching. I held his gaze. I'm not telling you it can't be rebuilt. I'm telling you what it costs. Eric's jaw tightened. His eyes were bright and wet at the edges, and he blinked twice fast, fighting it back. I know, he said. The person you need to say that to first isn't me, I said. It's your grandmother. He nodded. His throat worked visibly, the muscles in his neck pulling tight the way they do when a person is holding something in that wants very badly to come out. He pressed his lips together and looked down at the coffee cup and then back up at me, and for a moment he looked so much like the boy he used to be that something in my chest pulled in a way that had nothing to do with anger. Will she see me? He asked. His voice was smaller than I had heard it since he was a teenager. I don't know, I said honestly. That's her choice, not mine. He nodded again. He drank the coffee. He sat with me for another hour without talking much, and I let the quiet sit between us, the way the night had let me sit on the porch steps after everyone had gone home. Not empty, but full of something that didn't need to be named yet. When he left, I stood at the window and watched his truck pull out of the parking lot. The engine knock was still there, irregular and persistent. He really did need to get that looked at. I turned back to the empty apartment and thought about Eleanor in her hospital bed, waiting to come home. I thought about the coat lining and the yellow legal pad and the 7 pages of careful handwriting. I thought about what it means to love someone enough to protect them quietly, without asking for credit, without even letting them know you're doing it. I thought she taught me that. She taught me that my whole life, and I didn't know it until now. Eleanor came home on a Thursday in October. The mountains had already turned. By then the aspens on the lower slopes gone gold and trembling, the higher elevations dusted with the first light snow of the season. The sky that particular shade of blue that only happens in Montana in the fall, so deep and clear, it looks like something you could reach up and touch. I had spent the 3 days before her return cleaning the house from top to bottom, not because it needed it, but because I needed to do something with my hands that had a visible result. I had moved my things in the week before. Not much: a duffel bag of clothes, my coffee maker, the small radio I kept on the kitchen counter, the photograph of my parents that had lived on my bedside table for 30 years. The apartment near the freight yard was paid up through the end of the month. After that, I wouldn't be renewing the lease. Dr. Osei had cleared Eleanor for discharge with a set of instructions that ran to 2 pages and that I had read 4 times and committed to memory, the way I used to commit load tables to memory before a bridge inspection. Medication schedule. Physical therapy twice weekly at the Red Willow Clinic. Follow-up blood work in 6 weeks. He had shaken my hand at the door of the discharge suite and said, she argued with me about the physical therapy requirement for 20 minutes. I told her she'd won too much already to lose any ground now. He was smiling when he said it. So was I. I brought the wheelchair to the passenger side of the truck and helped Eleanor down from the seat, and she gripped my arm with both hands and got her feet under her with the careful deliberateness of a woman who has learned that dignity and assistance are not mutually exclusive. I settled her into the chair and turned it toward the house. She looked at it for a long moment without speaking. The string lights were gone from the porch railing. I had taken them down the morning after the arrest, standing on the steps in the dark, with my hands working the wire free, wanting them off the house. The railing itself needed repainting, I could see now in the October light. The second step had a soft spot that I had been meaning to address for 2 years. The window box on the east side was empty, the summer annuals long dead. Things to fix. There were always things to fix. The marigolds are gone, Eleanor said. I'll plant new ones in the spring, I said. She made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite dismissal, the sound she made when she was considering something and hadn't decided yet. Then she said, push me up. I pushed her up the ramp I had installed the previous week through the front door and into the house. She was quiet as I wheeled her through the rooms, the living room where the projection screen had stood, the dining room where the catering tables had been, the kitchen where Vanessa had stood at the stove 11 weeks ago, making Sunday chicken and telling me she had learned the recipe from my mother. Eleanor moved through each room with her hands in her lap and her eyes moving slowly over the walls, the furniture, the particular angles of light, through the windows, the way a person moves through a place they thought they might never see again, and are taking inventory of what remains. In the kitchen, she said, put the kettle on. I put the kettle on. While it heated, I moved around the kitchen, the way I had learned to move around it in the 3 days of cleaning, knowing where everything was, having put it back where it belonged. The tea canister on the second shelf, the mugs on the hooks, the small wooden tray Eleanor had used for as long as I could remember, worn smooth at the edges from decades of handling. I made the tea the way she liked it, strong, no sugar, a small pour of milk stirred in before the bag came out. I set it on the tray and carried it to the side porch, the narrow one that faced Dot's house, and I set the tray on the small table there and went back for Eleanor. The morning light was coming in low and golden across the mountains, the kind of light that makes everything it touches look like it has been there forever and will be there long after you are gone. I settled the wheelchair beside the table and locked the wheels and sat down in the chair across from my mother, and we looked at the mountains together. Dot appeared at her front door. Within 5 minutes she must have been watching for the truck and crossed the street carrying a covered plate that turned out to contain a dozen of the oatmeal cookies Eleanor had been eating at Dot's kitchen table for 30 years. She set the plate on the tray and said, "Welcome home, Eleanor." and Eleanor said, "Sit down, Dot, you're letting the cold in." And Dot sat, and the three of us drank tea and ate cookies in the October morning, with the mountains going gold in the distance. It was, I realized, the first ordinary moment in 11 weeks. Dot left after an hour saying she had a grocery delivery coming, squeezing Eleanor's hand at the door in a way that communicated everything they had been to each other for 30 years without requiring a single additional word. After she left, the porch was quiet again. Just the two of us and the cooling tea and the mountains and the sound of a truck somewhere out on the highway engine fading. Eleanor reached over and put her hand on mine. "Nathan," she said. "Yeah, Mom. You always come home when I need you." Her voice was even and quiet, the way it always was when she meant something most. I turned my hand over beneath hers and held it. Her fingers thin and cool and familiar, the ring she had worn for 60 years, still on her left hand, the skin loose over the knuckle now, but the ring itself going nowhere. My throat ached in a way that had become familiar over the past 11 weeks, the specific ache of feeling too much to say any of it. "Where else would I be?" I managed. She made the sound she always made when she thought I was being modest in a way that didn't serve me a small, private sound of disagreement that she had been making since I was 8 years old, and that I had somehow missed for the entire time I was living in the apartment near the freight yard. We sat until the tea was gone, and the cookies were mostly gone, and the morning light had shifted from gold to the clearer, cooler light of mid-morning. I refilled the pot and brought it back out, and we sat some more. There was no schedule. There was nowhere to be. At some point, Eleanor said, without preamble, "Eric called last week." I looked at her. "What did he say?" "He asked if he could come see me." She was looking at the mountains, not at me. "I told him not yet. I told him I needed some time first." She paused. "He said he understood." He didn't argue. "That's something," I said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She didn't say anything else about it, and I didn't push. The question of Eric was the kind of question that would answer itself over time the way most important questions do not through a single conversation, but through the slow accumulation of small things that add up eventually to a verdict. I looked at the mountains. The first snow on the upper elevations caught the mid-morning light and held it bright and indifferent and permanent. I spent 40 years making sure bridges didn't fall. I had spent the last 11 weeks learning something my mother had known her entire life, that the most important thing isn't always to prevent the crack. Sometimes the crack is how the light gets in. Sometimes what you build in the place where something broke is stronger than what was there before, because you know now exactly where the weakness was, and you build around it differently. Eleanor's hand was warm in mine. The mountains were still there. The tea was still hot. It was enough. The railing needed 2 coats. I discovered that on a Saturday morning in November, standing on the porch with a brush in my hand in the first serious cold of the season, pressing in from the Shell Creek Range. The paint I had put on the week before had dried unevenly too much humidity in the October air. I should have waited, and now the second coat was pulling differently on the north-facing boards than on the south-facing ones. I had always been better at inspecting things than at fixing them. That was the honest truth of 40 years in structural engineering. I could tell you what was wrong with a bridge to the millimeter. Knowing what was wrong and knowing how to make it right were 2 different skills, and the second one had always cost me more. Eleanor was on the porch behind me, wrapped in the thick wool cardigan, and watching me work with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether or not to offer advice. I knew the expression well enough to know it usually meant she had already decided. "You're going against the grain," she said. "I know. It'll streak." "I know that too." She made the sound the small private sound of disagreement and went back to her newspaper. I worked for another hour in the cold, going back over the sections I had done wrong, taking my time with them. The railing was cedar original to the house, installed by my grandfather in 1962, when he had replaced the pine that had rotted out. He had done it himself over a weekend, according to the story my mother had told me so many times it had become something close to family mythology. He had been 63 years old, and he had done it alone, and he had done it right. At some point, Eleanor set the newspaper down. "Nathan," she said. "Yeah, Mom. Eric called again last night." I set the brush across the top of the can and turned to look at her. She was watching the mountains, not me. "He calls every Thursday," she said. "I didn't tell you that." "No," I said. "You didn't." "He doesn't ask to come over. He just calls." She paused. "He tells me about his week, what he's been doing. Danny Pruitt got him work on a county road project, so he's been outdoors. He says it's good for him." Another pause. Last week he told me he fixed the knock in his truck engine. Something moved in my chest. Not grief exactly. Something quieter than that. He did, I said. Eleanor turned to look at me finally. Her eyes were clear and steady and entirely her own. I think I'm ready, she said. Not to forget it, not to pretend it didn't happen. She folded her hands in her lap with the careful deliberateness of a woman making a decision. But I'm ready to see what he does next. I picked up the brush. You want me to call him? I asked. No, she said. I'll do it myself, Thursday. She picked up the newspaper again. I turned back to the railing. The second coat was going on, better now, slower, more patient. Following the grain the way it was supposed to be followed. By the time I finished, the light had shifted to the flat gray of late afternoon, and Eleanor had gone inside for her tea. I cleaned the brush at the utility sink, working the paint out of the bristles with the same methodical attention I had given to everything else that fall every repaired step, every rehung photograph, every small thing in the house that had been waiting to be put back the way it was supposed to be. The window box on the east side was still empty. I had ordered bulbs from a nursery catalog and Billings daffodils and early tulips, the kind that pushed through the last of the snow in April. They had arrived 2 weeks ago in a brown paper bag and were sitting on the potting shelf in the garage. I wasn't going to plant them today. The ground was too cold, but I knew where they were, and I knew they would be ready when the time came. That night, sitting at the kitchen table, while Eleanor slept and the November wind moved through the aspens, I thought about what she had said. I'm ready to see what he does next. Not forgiveness, not erasure, just the willingness to watch, to wait, to give a person the space to show you who they're trying to become. I thought about Bridges again, the way I always did. Eric came on a Saturday in December, 6 weeks after he had moved his things out of the family house. Eleanor had called him the Thursday before. He arrived 2 days later without warning, the way people do when they have finally made up their minds about something and don't want to give themselves time to change them. That was the first thing I noticed when I heard the knock. 2 knocks the way he had knocked on doors since he was a boy. The rhythm so familiar it reached me somewhere below conscious thought before I had even registered the sound. I was in the kitchen washing the breakfast dishes. Eleanor was on the side porch with her coffee, and the newspaper bundled in the heavy wool cardigan she refused to replace despite the fact that the left elbow had worn through. I dried my hands and went to the door. He was standing on the newly repaired porch steps in a canvas work jacket, his breath making small clouds in the December air. He looked thinner than he had in August, thinner and older, and something else that I didn't have a word for until I recognized it as the specific quality of a man who has been spending time alone with himself and has not particularly enjoyed the company. In his hand was a small paper bag. "Oatmeal cookies," he said. His voice was careful, measured. The voice of someone who has rehearsed an opening and is now discovering that the rehearsal didn't fully prepare him for the actual moment. "From the bakery on 3rd. I know Dot brings them, but I didn't want to come empty-handed." "Come in," I said. He stepped inside and stopped in the hallway, taking in the house slowly. The freshly painted walls, the repaired threshold, the photograph of my parents that I had rehung slightly higher than it had been before. His eyes moved through the space with a particular attention of someone cataloging what has changed in their absence, trying to locate themselves in a place that has shifted without them. "She's on the porch," I said. He swallowed. His jaw worked once. "Does she know I'm coming?" "No," I said. He nodded as if this was both what he expected and what he deserved. He held the paper bag with both hands now, his knuckles pale against the brown paper. I watched him gather something, not courage exactly, but the functional equivalent of it, the thing that moves a person forward when courage isn't quite available. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay." I led him through the kitchen and opened the door to the side porch. Eleanor looked up from her newspaper. She looked at Eric for a long moment without speaking. Her face did the complicated thing it sometimes does, the thing I had spent 65 years learning to read, cycling through several things at once before settling into something that was not warm and not cold, but was instead the careful assessing expression of a woman deciding what she owes a situation. Eric stepped out onto the porch. He did not sit. He stood in front of his grandmother's wheelchair with the paper bag still in both hands, and he looked at her, and his eyes were already filling, already bright and wet at the edges, and he didn't try to stop it. "Grandma," he said, "I'm not going to ask you to forgive me today. I know I don't have the right to ask for that yet." His throat worked visibly. I needed to see you, and I needed you to see me. Not the person I was in that room in August, the person I'm trying to be now." Eleanor folded the newspaper in her lap. "Sit down, Eric," she said. He sat in the chair across from her, the same chair I sat in every morning with my coffee, and he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at his grandmother's face with the full, unguarded attention of someone who has stopped performing and is simply present. "I've been thinking about what I did," he said. "Not just the thing I didn't do in that room, but all the things before it. All the times I chose not to ask a question because the answer might cost me something." His voice was thickening, breaking slightly at the seams. "I watched Vanessa build something terrible inside our house, and I told myself I didn't know, and the truth is, I didn't let myself know. Those aren't the same thing, and I pretended they were for a long time." Eleanor listened. She did not nod or lean forward or give him any signal to continue. She simply listened the way she had listened to things that mattered her entire life completely, without performing it, without making it about her own response. When he finished, the porch was quiet for a long moment. The December air moved through the bare aspens at the property line, making them knock softly against each other. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and stopped. Then Eleanor unfolded her hands and placed one of them flat on the small table between them. "The worst part," she said, "was not what she did to me." Her voice was steady and deliberate, each word landing with the weight of something that had been considered for a long time before being spoken. "I am 103 years old, Eric. People have tried to take things from me before. I am still here." She looked at him without blinking. "The worst part was lying on that floor and watching you look at me and choose her. That is what I have been carrying, not the bruise, not the fear, the look on your face." Eric's chin was trembling. Tears were running down his face freely now, and he made no move to wipe them, sitting in the December cold with his grandmother's words in him, like something being set down after a very long carry. "I know," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I know. I am so sorry, Grandma. I am so sorry." Eleanor looked at him for another long moment. Then she moved her hand across the table and placed it over his. Her fingers thin and cool and carrying all 103 years of her pressed down onto his knuckles, with a grip that was stronger than it looked and that did not let go. "You came back," she said. "You stood up in that room when it would have been easier to stay where you were." A pause. "That doesn't undo what happened. I want you to understand that clearly it does not undo it, but it counts for something, Eric. I want you to know that it counts." Eric bent forward over their joined hands, and his shoulders shook once hard, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere below grief, from the place where shame and relief and love all occupy the same space at the same time. He pressed his forehead against the backs of her fingers, and she let him, her hand steady and unmoving, beneath his face, not pulling away, not offering false comfort, simply holding on. I was standing in the kitchen doorway. I did not step onto the porch. Some moments belong only to the people inside them, and the best thing a person can do is understand that and stay back. After a while, Eric straightened. He drew a long, shaking breath that steadied by the end of it. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked at his grandmother with red-rimmed eyes that were clearer than they had been when he walked in. Eleanor withdrew her hand and picked up her coffee cup. "Open the cookies," she said. "They'll go stale if we leave them in the bag." Eric laughed a short, startled sound, the laugh of a man who wasn't expecting to laugh and is genuinely surprised by it. He opened the bag, and I passed him a plate from inside the kitchen, and he arranged the cookies on it and set it on the table between them. I made a fresh pot of coffee. I brought 3 cups out to the porch and sat in the third chair, and the 3 of us sat together in the December morning and ate oatmeal cookies and drank coffee and talked about small things, whether the window box should have bulbs planted in it for spring, the railing that still needed a second coat of paint, the way the mountains looked when the low winter light hit the fresh snow on the upper slopes. Nobody mentioned August. Nobody mentioned the trial or the charges or the woman who had stood in this house in a white dress and believed she had already won. Those things existed and would continue to exist, folded into the history of this family, the way all difficult things eventually fold, in present but not dominant, acknowledged but not in charge of the room. When Eric left an hour later, he stopped on the porch and looked back at me. "Dad," he said. "I know," I said. He nodded. He went down the repaired steps to his truck. The engine turned over that familiar knock still there, the one he had been meaning to fix for 2 years. But something in the way he pulled out of the driveway told me that this time, finally, he actually would. I stood on the porch and watched until his truck turned the corner and disappeared. Behind me, Eleanor said, "Nathan, come finish your coffee before it gets cold." I turned back into the house. The hallway was warm. The kitchen smelled like coffee and oatmeal cookies and the particular smell of a place that has been lived in for a long time by people who kept choosing to come back to it. I sat back down at the table. My mother poured me more coffee without being asked. Outside, the mountains were white and still and permanent the way they had always been, and would be long after all of us were gone. Some cracks you can see, she had told me once, some you can't. She was right about that. She was right about most things. It was enough. It had always in the end been enough. I've been a bridge engineer for 40 years. I thought I knew what it meant to hold things together. But this family story taught me something no blueprint ever could. I almost missed it. I almost told myself the cracks weren't there because looking at them meant admitting something I wasn't ready to face. If you see something wrong inside your own family story, don't do what I did. Don't wait. Don't look away. The person who needs you can't always afford the time it takes you to get comfortable with the truth. I believe God puts certain people in our path at exactly the right moment. A 15-year-old girl with a USB drive a neighbor who kept a secret for 6 months, a son who finally chose to stand up. None of that was an accident. Family betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it walks through your front door, learns your mother's recipes, and smiles for the camera. That's what makes family betrayal so devastating, and why staying awake to the people you love is the most important work you'll ever do. If this family story of love, courage, and family betrayal moved you in any way, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell me what would you have done differently. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. Thank you for staying until the very end. The stories ahead contain some fictional elements crafted for reflection and life lessons. If that's not for you, no hard feelings. Choose what feeds your soul.